Progress occurs when courageous, skillful leaders seize the opportunity to change things for the better. Harry S. Truman. The day is April 12, 1945. The President of the United States has just passed away and left you in charge of a nation in the midst of war. Your enemy refuses to surrender, but you have a powerful weapon that can obliterate cities and possibly end the conflict. Do you start a land invasion of a country you've been at war with for almost half a decade? Or do you use the weapon and kill thousands of civilians instantly? This was the question facing 33rd President Harry S. Truman as he assumed the presidency from his recently deceased predecessor, Franklin Roosevelt. His choices, along with the choices of his successor, Dwight D. Eisenhower, would ultimately define how the United States would be seen for the second half of the 20th century. Welcome back to RAC's Presidential Park Series, where we take a look at the presidents of the United States through the national parks that honor and define them. Today we look into the lives of Truman and Eisenhower and how their presidencies affected the National Park Service and the country as a whole. Without further ado, let's begin. Harry S. Truman came from the small town of Lamar, Missouri, born in 1884. The Harry S. Truman Birthplace State Historic Site commemorates his birthplace, and Truman was actually still alive when it was dedicated, signing his name on the guest list as retired farmer. From Lamar, the Truman family moved around before settling in Independence, Missouri in 1890, where Truman would work as a farmer after graduating high school at the turn of the century. Life, however, had different plans for him. When America entered into World War I in 1917, Truman enlisted in the Army and was soon promoted to commander. Following the war, he married a girl he had loved since he was a child, Bess, and in 1919 moved into a new home in Independence, which would be his primary residence for the rest of his life, with the exception of his presidency. This home is now preserved as Harry S. Truman National Historic Site. From Independence, Truman began his steady ascent into politics, rising from a judge on the Jackson County Court located in the Kansas City metro area to a senator in the 1930s, and eventually making his way onto the Senate War Investigating Committee during World War II. In 1944, Franklin Roosevelt chose Truman to be his running mate, despite preferring his current vice president Henry Wallace. Roosevelt won the election, but his health worsened, and only months into his new term, he passed away and suddenly the moderate from Missouri was in charge of the highest office in the land. Truman entered into the presidency as the Second World War was drawing to a close. Within a few weeks of Truman becoming president, Nazi Germany had been defeated and only Japan remained. A fierce campaign had been going on in the Pacific since the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor Naval Base in 1941, and troops were drawing close to the main Japanese islands. Truman had to make a difficult decision as to whether the US should proceed with an invasion of the mainland, or if the United States should use a new weapon they had been testing, the atomic bomb. The bomb was capable of much more destruction than any prior weapon, and would certainly cause many hundreds of thousands of Japanese citizens to perish in the explosion and ensuing radiation exposure. There is still much debate today over Truman's choice, but he ultimately chose to drop the atomic bomb over two Japanese cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, after which the Japanese finally surrendered. Even though the Second World War was over, Truman, the US, and the rest of the world had now entered into a new age with the dropping of the atomic bomb, the nuclear age. Much of Truman's presidency dealt with the immediate fallout of World War II, including the looming presence of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe. The city of Berlin, Germany was split up into different sectors following the war, and when the Soviets blocked supplies heading to the western portions of the city, Truman provided supplies via air in what would become known as the Berlin Airlift. During his presidency, Truman would often find himself wanting a change of scenery from Washington, D.C., and would return to his house in Independence for use as a summer home. He also used a residence in Key West, Florida, known as the Little White House. Both homes are now preserved as historic sites, the former by the NPS as mentioned above, the latter by a local group. Truman chose to run for a second term as president and won the election despite his opponent, Thomas Dewey, being predicted to win. In his second term, Truman dealt with conflicts in Korea before choosing not to run for a third term in 1952. After his presidency, Truman returned to Missouri, where he would live out the rest of his days to the ripe old age of 88 in 1972. Following Truman was America's 34th president, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Hailing from Abilene, Kansas, Eisenhower was actually born in Texas in 1890 before moving to Abilene. He grew up in Abilene and attended West Point Military Academy, graduating in 1915. America would enter World War I only 2 years later in 1917. Eisenhower wanted to fight in Europe, but instead ended up commanding a training center near, of all places, Gettysburg Battlefield in Pennsylvania. After the war, Eisenhower continued to rise up the military ranks through the outbreak of the Second World War. During World War II, Eisenhower helped lead the invasion of North Africa and Italy, and is probably most famously known for becoming the Supreme Allied Commander, directing the invasion of France on D-Day, June 6, 1944. Following the German and Japanese surrender, Eisenhower retired from active military service in 1948, ending up at Columbia University as its president. Eisenhower was in some aspects similar to another military general who went on to be president, Ulysses S. Grant. Both men were initially hesitant to run for the presidency despite being popular war heroes, in Grant's case, the war being the Civil War. Both men were eventually drawn towards politics, and in Eisenhower's case, both parties wanted him to run on their side. Eisenhower eventually chose to run as a Republican, using the slogan, "I like Ike." His campaign was successful, and Ike was elected in a landslide. He would leave behind the farm home in Gettysburg that he and his wife Mamie had purchased in 1950 that reminded him of his training camp days in World War I. That farm would go on to be a place where Eisenhower would host world leaders and would live at post-presidency until his death. In 1967, Eisenhower donated the farm to the National Park Service 2 years before he passed in 1969. The Eisenhower National Historic Site opened to the public in 1980. During his presidency, Eisenhower continued some of Truman's policies, as well as introducing some big ideas of his own, including the interstate highway system in 1956. Also in 1956, the U.S. established a national park in the Virgin Islands and began Mission 66, a 10-year program dedicated to upgrading resources around the national park system in time for the NPS's 50th anniversary. These included new visitor centers, residences for park employees, and new employee training centers. At year's end, Eisenhower was re-elected to his second term, and his second term saw him deal with other pressing issues, including civil rights in Little Rock, Arkansas, sending the National Guard to desegregate Little Rock Central High School, now a National Historic Site. With the Soviet launch of the satellite Sputnik 1 in 1957, the US and USSR entered into the space race, which would continue beyond Eisenhower's presidency into the following decade. Speaking of the following decade, Eisenhower's second term ended in the beginning of 1961, and he retired to his aforementioned farm home where he would live out the rest of his days. Both Harry S. Truman and Dwight D. Eisenhower are considered some of America's best presidents, and both men left undeniable impacts on the United States in the years following World War II. As they grew the nation permanently out of isolationism, so grew the National Park Service, striving to improve itself as it approached the half-century anniversary of its existence. And in our next presidential parks video, we'll see the presidents that governed during that historic anniversary, and saw the US go out of this world. Until then, you've been watching RAC Adventures, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.